friends, I am Vitaly Portnikov. Amid discussions about peace negotiations and proposals from the head of Russia's foreign ministry, Sergei Lavrov, to meet again in Istanbul, Russia, according to the New York Times and other Western publications, appears to have launched a summer offensive against Ukrainian positions. Russian troops, as observers emphasize, are now advancing at a much more significant pace and intensifying attacks on the territory in eastern Ukraine that remains, particularly in the Donetsk region, under the control of the armed forces of Ukraine. Russia's summer offensive may have several objectives that the Kremlin would like to achieve. The first objective remains unchanged, and President Vladimir Putin said it before his army all the way back in February 2022, when he made the decision for the so-called major assault on Ukraine. This is reaching the administrative borders of Ukraine's Donetsk and Luhansk regions, which Russia at the time also referred to as the so-called People's Republics. The second objective could potentially be related to, in particular, the creation of a so-called buffer zone, something Putin has already mentioned as an important goal of this war. The buffer zone in this context is merely a cover for Russia's ambitions. On the one hand, there is absolutely no doubt whatsoever that the Russian political and military leadership, especially in the current context and against the backdrop of Ukraine's steadily increasing ability to strike Russian territory from Ukrainian positions, not only with drones, but also, at least in theory, with missiles that Ukraine could potentially receive from Western countries, would very much like to reduce the threat to the Russian capital and as a result push the front line as far from Moscow as possible in order to further minimize the possibility of strikes on the city itself. But this is by no means the only objective behind creating the so-called buffer zone. After all, when the Russian Federation occupies and takes control of part of a Ukrainian region, it can then declare this territory as one where a so-called referendum can be held on joining the Russian Federation, and in addition proclaim this or that Ukrainian oblast as a so-called independent state, even if only for an hour or so. This is exactly what happened, for example, with both the Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions in Ukraine. And this is despite the fact that in the Zaporizhzhia region, even the regional center was never under the control of the Russian occupiers. It was precisely such a referendum that the Russian authorities were preparing in the Kharkiv region when they managed to briefly establish control over Kupiansk. Let me remind you that it was this city that was then declared the temporary regional center of the Kharkiv region, of course, with the expectation of eventually gaining control over the entire territory of this Ukrainian region. And now all this talk about the buffer zone may reflect Moscow's desire to expand the occupied territory of Ukraine and prepare it for a new annexation. So, when the head of the Russian delegation at the negotiations in Istanbul, Vladimir Medinsky, warned the Ukrainian participants that soon Russia might demand not 5, but 7 or even 8 Ukrainian regions, he was in fact not lying, as surprising as that may seem. At least these are the objectives that Putin is setting for his army. The third very important point related to the Russian offensive happening right now is the pressure on the Ukrainian delegation, on the negotiations, and on the Ukrainian government so that they ultimately agree to unfavorable terms. And it is clear that there is no other alternative except for Ukraine's capitulation to the Russian political regime. This is exactly what the massive bombardment of Ukraine was intended for, which, as we can see, preceded this offensive. The bombardment was aimed at destroying the military and military technological capabilities of the enemy state, as well as demoralizing its population. The intention is to convince Ukrainians that they have no other option but to capitulate, and that they should pressure the Ukrainian government to accept the terms that Putin will announce in the so-called memorandum and during new rounds of Russian-Ukrainian talks, if, of course, these rounds take place in the near future. But there is also a risk for Putin in the Russian Federation's summer offensive. First of all, it is important to note that the Russian troops may not potentially achieve the results that the Kremlin is counting on. And thus, it will once again be demonstrated that the Russian-Ukrainian war has actually been at a stalemate since 2023, that the front line has not changed significantly, and that this situation could persist for many more years of conflict. And this, in turn, will lead not only to the exhaustion of Ukraine, but also to the exhaustion of Russia, which could create serious problems for the survival of the Putin regime itself. Secondly, as we can see, the Russians' attempts to demoralize the Ukrainian population are not producing the expected results. On the contrary, they are strengthening the position of those who believe that Ukraine should not accept the disgraceful terms of capitulation proposed by the Russian political leadership. Thirdly, Russia is suffering serious losses from a geopolitical standpoint. The massive shelling of Ukrainian territory provoked not only an angry response from European leaders, which of course was exactly what the Russian capital was counting on, but also unexpectedly sharp reaction from US. President Donald Trump, with whom Putin considers his dialogue to be a major diplomatic achievement and whom he would like to keep engaged precisely against the backdrop of ongoing military actions against Ukraine. And the fact that Trump is now reproaching Putin and even setting new deadlines, such as, for example, 2 weeks after which he must decide on the Russian president's peaceful intentions, this, of course, is something the Russian president cannot possibly be satisfied with. If the Russian offensive against Ukrainian positions intensifies this, if not convincing Trump that the Russian president has no intention of making any decisions that could lead to an end to the Russian-Ukrainian war in the near future, will at least show the American president that the whole world sees he is essentially creating comfortable conditions for President Putin to continue the Russian-Ukrainian war. President Trump, of course, cannot and does not want to allow such reputational losses for himself. And in this situation, we need to realize that Putin, as always, is taking a risk when he tries to gain too much from the situation that has developed in the Russian-Ukrainian war after Donald Trump's victory in the US presidential elections and the start of a new round of Russian-American dialogue, and his attempts to seize yet another part of Ukrainian territory can only complicate these dialogues and his own position in the Russian-Ukrainian war. Thank you, friends. Stay, subscribe, follow on social media, and support via Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, or Donatello to help these resources. Use YouTube sponsorship. Wishing you victory and peace. Good luck.